Here we have a unit that is sort of a hodgepodge, as you can see. So every single thing up here is going to end up leading to the Civil War. Reform, slavery, sectionalism, and compromise. Basically, all of this culminates into change, and people do not like change. So we are at A Push Unit 13, Period 5, 1844 to 1877. Let's start with the reform movements. The Second Great Awakening, that series of outdoor religious revivals, is really what started the reform movement. Because it was a place where you gathered with many, many people. And this time it's going to be different. It's all outdoors. It's all very welcoming to women for the very first time. Women were not just there, they were also speaking, very active. And so it gave women and men a platform to be heard by many people. And so the first Great Awakening, where it brought people together and allowed them to think differently, enlightenment kind of thoughts, here you have an even greater Great Awakening, not just to religion, but to the social ills that are happening at the time. So social activism and reform are a huge part of that second Great Awakening. And women, like I said, are also very involved, much more than in the first Great Awakening. And here you have your four major reform topics being discussed: temperance, education, female suffrage, and abolition. So let's start with temperance. Temperance was a really big issue during the time because women were starting to speak out about abuse. Their abuse on their own person, abuse on their children, and many blamed the alcohol for it. And so women joined together with men, but mostly women, and created the American Temperance Society. And it was church based, it's part of the Second Great Awakening. And women began to call any kind of alcohol demon rum. And that in itself is a connotation that liquor is evil. And they kind of ran along the thought that when a man drinks, he opens his soul and the devil comes in and takes over. So that's where you get your religious tie in there. It was much more popular in the north, but that is only because there were more places for people to gather. It was easier to get in trouble, I guess you could say. It's not that liquor was easier to get because people were making it in the south, but it was that gathering and men egging each other on and getting into fist fights and all that kind of stuff. So usually in this time period, if you were part of one movement, you were part of many movements, and most women who were part of temperance were also part of abolition, and many more even were part of women's rights as well. So you see here at the bottom that temperance actually leads to NASCAR. Well, you know, I hope you know that the ladies are going to win, and the 18th Amendment is created to outlaw liquor. And of course, people aren't going to stop drinking; they love it too much, and so it becomes a black market item. And people are driving at the time period, and they have to learn to drive really fast and crazy to get away from the police who are chasing them. And so you hired professional drivers to get your stuff from one point to another, and sometimes they had to go on these crazy terrible roads and outrun people that were chasing them. And so all of that, men started to realize that there was this huge adrenaline pump by driving fast and driving crazy, and it actually became a sport, and that will lead to NASCAR. Women not wanting men to drink leads to NASCAR. Who'd have thunk it? So let's look at a couple of the ways that women advertised their thoughts on temperance. And a big thing was to withhold sexual favors. If you were a woman who didn't want her husband to drink, then, or you just wanted to make a point, then you would say things like, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. And it was successful, that campaign. To add to it, the thing that you see over here on the right, and this is a lot of media promoted the idea that liquor made men violent. Like across the board, it made men violent. You saw lots and lots of magazines and newspapers filled with pictures such as this, where the father is beating the mother and the poor kids are involved. And I don't know who that is coming in the door, grandma or whatever. But it promoted the idea that drinking led to violence. And so women were good at this. Women were really good at reform and getting the word out and plugging on the heartstrings of others. And it becomes the very first successful national reform movement. So, like I said, they got what they wanted. They will get the 18th Amendment, which outlaws liquor, and of course, will bring it back with the 21st. But they win temporarily, so that's big. Let's look at education. You guys have heard this guy's name before, Horace Mann. Horace Mann became the father of American public education, and we still use the rules that he came up with today, many of them, not all of them, but many. And here's the three basic ones in front of you. School will be free and supported by taxes. Why should it be supported by taxes? Because then the parents are vested in the school, not only because their children are there, but because their money is paying for that school. And so they will monitor teachers and make sure that their children are getting a good education. So it was a way of creating a system of watchdogs who's, but the parents there, not wanting to pay money if it's not a good school. Teachers had to be trained for the first time. You couldn't just say, hey, I'm a teacher, and be off on your new career. You had to actually be trained, and children were going to be required to attend school. Now, this one's going to be a lot slower. It starts in Massachusetts. It's not going to be a national law for quite a while, but Horace Mann is the guy who starts it. He says that our country needed to be educated, and the only way to do that was to make children go to school. So by 1850, most schools in the North and the West were following his plan. South, you got to remember, they're much more isolated. It's going to take them a while to get caught up. But here's the basics of how it ran. You had a 6 month on, 6 month off, and it coincided with the crops. So that if there were farmers in the North, and there were many in the West, kids would still be able to help with the crops. Again, because of crops and working at home and helping mom and dad, 10 to 2 was their school day with an hour of lunch and play called nooning because it started at noon. There was one room for all the grades, and you had to go to at least the eighth grade. You could go beyond that if you wanted to, but that wasn't mandatory. Only through eighth grade was mandatory. So kids today would love this schedule, right? So does that mean that they were not as educated as us? Well, you tell me. Here's your eighth grade final. And if you didn't pass it, you didn't graduate. You had a test like this at the end of every grade that you were attempting to be done with. And if you didn't pass, you stayed in that grade. But this one's really big. Eighth grade final is really big to get you out of school, especially for girls. Because in 1855, eighth grade, girls are looking to get married 14, 15 years old, and you're not going to get married while you're still in school. You can't. You have to go to school. It's mandatory. You can't be a wife and a mom and go to school. So take a look at this test and see, do you think that you could do this in the time given? So in their tiny little school day of really only 3 hours, because they have an hour break, look what these kids could do by the eighth grade and within that time limit. And here's a little bit more. So, one of the things that kids always ask me about is this number 5 under U.S. history. Tell what you can of the history of Kansas. We'll get to that. Kansas was a big deal in 1855, and we will get to that. So, orthography, I also have students ask me what that is. It's kind of the rules of spelling with some other stuff thrown in there too, like things that they couldn't really call grammatical, but it has to do with language and spelling. And so, look at this. What is meant by orthography? I just explained it to you. Etymology. I mean, half these words I'll bet you guys can't say without some practice, right? And these kids knew it. So just a different time, different mentality, but they were pretty smart kids. So we're moving through here pretty fast. Let's look at the ladies. We've already talked about them with temperance, but you know that one of their number one goals in the 1800s was female suffrage. So how did that start? It starts in 1848. In 1848, women planned for the first time to meet as an organized group. Some men are going to come too, and they're going to start talking about ways to get suffrage, and they're going to have their voices heard as a group for the very first time. It just so happens that 1848 was a bad year for the ladies to pick, just bad luck. 1848 is when gold is discovered, and the world that as we know it here in America is going to explode and change overnight because of the gold rush. So that's our west coast, and people migrating across the country and the government trying to handle that. But on top of it, 1848 is when we get our first giant swell of immigrants coming out of Ireland and other European places because of bad crops that year. This is the year that we have the Irish potato famine, and that's a whole other story. But 1848, we're dealing with all these immigrants. The government did not want to hear what the women had to say. They had a lot of problems going on as it was. We had just finished the Mexican American War and we're trying to settle things with that. So, but the ladies decided to have it anyway, and they held it in Seneca Falls, New York. So it's called the Seneca Falls Convention. The two ladies that organized it, the leaders, are Lucretia Mott, she's the lower picture here, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So the two of them are the ones that actually created the idea of having the Seneca Falls Convention. They also wrote a document, and it's very similar to the Declaration of Independence. They mirrored it after the Declaration of Independence that was written by men so that men could not look at their declaration of sentiments and say, oh, this is no good, this is silly, it's stupid. How can it be when our entire country is run by the Declaration of Independence, which mirrors it? So the Declaration of Sentiments is basically the complaints that women have against men, and it's the same language that America used in their complaints against King George. So it does shake, rattle, and roll a couple people, but it's 1848, like I said, and not a lot is going to get done. But they become organized. So this is that very first step. Susan B. Anthony is given a whole lot of credit for getting women the right to vote, and she deserves it, yes. But don't confuse who was actually the person who organized that very first convention. Kids always tend to throw Susan in there, and it was not her. She was not there. She will meet Elizabeth later, and they will become really good friends. And Anthony will become a very famous suffragette later. She is asked to write the 19th Amendment, and she does. That's why she becomes so famous, because she actually wrote the amendment that we have now as part of our law of America. She's the author, and so that made her super famous. So she wrote the 19th Amendment. It does not get passed before she passes away, but they still used it, even though she had died before the amendment was finally passed in 1920. So be a mathematician for 2 seconds. 1848 to 1920. How many years did women struggle to get that right to vote? Ready? One, two, three. You should already have it. Yeah, 72 years. How many of you got it before me? Probably none of you, right? Okay, so anyway, 72 years. And ladies that are listening, I got to tell you, you need to keep this in mind when you're standing there getting ready to cast your vote. Remember these ladies. They didn't just stand up and say, please, please, please. They fought, they struggled, they bled, they starved themselves, they were killed, they committed suicide to get attention for the cause. So it's not 72 years of please, sir, please. It's 72 years of battle, of revolution, of fighting on a battlefield that men in many cases are not willing to recognize, and women are just kind of pushed aside regardless of the tactics that they use until the very end in 1920. So we owe a lot to these women. 72 years is a long time to be willing to fight for one cause. Abolition usually went hand in hand with female suffrage. So if you have a woman that is a suffragette, she's probably an abolitionist. Now, not in every case. Suffragettes, in some cases, when they were, for instance, marching in a parade, suffragettes in some towns would not allow black women to march with them. So I don't want you to think that a suffragette was automatically not racist. But suffragettes usually were also part of abolition. They just didn't want the freed slaves to be part of their group. So, things are so weird and mixed up in this time period. So, what is the difference between an abolitionist and a person who just says slavery is bad and they want to get rid of it? An abolitionist wants rid of slavery immediately. They want Congress to make a law that says it is done, no compromise, no waiting period. Somebody that is not an abolitionist wants slavery gone, but they're willing to allow the country to slowly get out of that peculiar institution, and knowing that it's going to turn the country upside down. But an abolitionist says, no, let's do it right now. So abolitionists become kind of the evil people of the day, according to Southerners. So people too know that our famous abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison, here at the top, was an elder gentleman when he really got into the abolitionist movement. He also wanted female suffrage, so he was part of that. He got a newspaper, created a newspaper called The Liberator, and it was mostly about abolition, but he also put articles in it concerning women's rights. William Lloyd Garrison was not a young man, you can see from the picture, but he was not going to be quiet. He stood on street corners to sell his own newspaper and tried to talk to people about abolition. And did he get in trouble? Yes, he got beat up all the time, but as soon as he was well enough, he would go right back out to the street corner again. This mattered to him. Now, Frederick Douglass, he's the second man you see here. Frederick Douglass was actually born a slave. His master was also his father, and that was well known. His father didn't have a problem telling him that. And his father was very, very abusive to him. So Frederick Douglass is going to run away. He's going to escape slavery as a young kid, and he's going to end up working along the docks in the North. Now, he immediately realizes, even as a kid, that the only way for him to ever really make great change among America and to convince Americans of the evil of slavery is to be educated. But you can't go to school as a black child in this time period. So he tricked other children into teaching him the alphabet and how to spell by saying things like, I know the sound that the letter D makes. And he, of course, would make the wrong sound, and the white children would say, ha ha ha, you're so stupid. This is the sound that it makes. And they would make the sound for him, and he would remember it. And same thing with spelling. He would spell something in the dirt, even just a single letter, and do the same thing. And the kids would be like, oh, that's not a letter A. This is an A. And they would draw it for him, and he would remember it. He was that smart. So he became a very, very famous abolitionist under the wing of William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison introduced him to a lot of very influential people, so much so that Frederick Douglass actually became more famous than William Lloyd Garrison, to the point that during the Civil War, Lincoln and Douglass will meet several times. Lincoln comes to Douglass and asks his advice. So Frederick Douglass will also have a newspaper. He names it the North Star, because slaves followed the North Star along the Underground Railroad to escape to freedom, and so he will be very influential as well. We will talk about him again when we get into the Civil War and his relationship with Lincoln. The last abolitionist we're going to talk about, and we're going to come back to her later in the unit as well, is Harriet Beecher Stowe. So Harriet Beecher Stowe was also a writer. She was a Quaker, and she found out about slavery in the South, the reality of it, and wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it rocked the United States. It just rocked us. So, again, we will come back to Harriet later in the unit, but I just want to put her in with Garrison and Douglass so you can better group her with them. So, three top abolitionists: Garrison, Douglass, and Stowe. Let's take a much more detailed look at slavery. You should also know it as the peculiar institution. Also, remember that foreign slave trade was banned in 1808. Toussaint Louverture is at fault for that. In Haiti, he led a very successful, or completely successful, slave revolt against the French, chased the French out, and all the slaves on the island of Haiti got their freedom, and it scared America. So in 1808 we said no new slaves coming from outside of the country. So you'll hear it as foreign slave trade banned. That simply means no new slaves coming in from outside of America. They all now had to be native born after 1808. Remember also, by 1840, cotton is king because Eli Whitney made it so easy to harvest and get to market. So we need slaves because cotton is king, but we can't get more slaves from the outside because of Toussaint Louverture and his successful Haiti slave revolt. So how do you get new slaves? Sometimes it was nothing more than a promise of extra food and privileges for every baby that a woman had, or maybe even a husband and wife had together. So it wasn't always a violent event. Freedom for mom after she had a certain number of kids. The problem is you can't take your children with you. So not all women were willing to leave. Not even a majority of them were willing to leave. Masters and overseers were different from plantation to plantation. So you cannot say that every master and every overseer were were bad people or treated their slaves inhumanely. What's the difference between a master and an overseer? A master is the guy who owns everything. On the larger plantations, not that there were many, but on the larger ones, a slave may never even see his true master. It's the overseer that is the one who's kind of in charge of what happens with the slaves, who gets what job. If there's a punishment to be dealt, the overseer might be allowed to make that decision on his own without the master's permission. Now, an overseer is always going to be white. And we'll get into the layers of that kind of society, the plantation society, in a minute. But I want you to take a look at this poster where they're advertising an auction that's about to come in January 10th of 1855. So look at the list here. 3 bucks, that means men. So men were called bucks, women were called wenches. And look at Sally. Sally is age 42. She obviously is not going to be able to produce children at the age of 42, or at least not many. But they have to advertise her as something so that people will come to take Sally and buy her. So she's labeled as an excellent cook. Look at the wench under her, Lizzie. Lizzie's 23 and has a 6-month-old pickaninny. So black babies were called pickaninnies. You also have a 1 buck, age 52, a good kennel man. That basically means that he was one of the guys who was, how do I say this politely, in charge of impregnating slave women. And apparently he was really good at it. So he's advertised as a good kennel man. Now look at the last one, 17 bucks, age 12 to 20. So there are some babies in there. They're pretty tiny, 12 years old. How do you avoid a terrible, terrible scene where mom and dad and children are screaming because they don't want to be separated? You pick a certain day of the year to take the kids away, and most often that will be New Year's Day. So the slave masters would go down and into the slave quarters, or maybe it was the overseer, go down into the slave quarters and give everybody rum and food and throw a party, and just get everybody as toasted as they could possibly get them, including the children. And then in the early morning, the people would go into the slave quarters and just pull the babies out of their beds in the middle of the night. And when I say babies, I mean like the 12 and 13-year-old, or maybe it was a baby. Who knows? It could have been. But you would drag the children out of their beds, half asleep, half hungover. Mom and dad are sound asleep from drinking too much. So it's a very quiet event. To take the children early on New Year's Day. And then you see the poster here, January 10th. So they would have gathered the slaves in probably a gathering barn and kept them there until the event on January 10th. So very, very evil type of situation here. So let's look at some statistics on slavery. Up until this point, we've worked under the idea that there were more blacks in the South than there were whites, and that was true for a while. But by 1860, and that's the year that the Civil War is going to start, more people had moved into the South in order to find a living as a farmer. And so now you have it switched around. So you've got 8 million whites in the South and 4 million slaves. So by 1860, look at this statistic. Kids always think this is wrong, but it's not. Only 8% of the South owned slaves. There was good land in the South, but it didn't mean that everybody in the South was rich. So if you had a small farm, you might make a decent living for your family. You don't have to worry about food on the table, but is your property going to be large enough to need slaves? No. Southern mentality was not, oh, we have to have slaves or we're, not like Bob next door and we're not as good as him. It wasn't like that. You got slaves because you needed them for labor, not so you could be mean to somebody or say you owned somebody. So 8%, that's it. 37,000 had more than 20. Look at this. Only 11 plantations had more than 500. The one that you see off to the side here is a picture of the Magnolia plantation in South Carolina. And this was one of the larger ones. And even this plantation with 500 people on it didn't have an evil reputation. Most of the slaves, even after they were freed after the Civil War, said that they were never treated badly on the Magnolia plantation. So it just depended on where you were. The majority of these farmers in the South, again, didn't have the money, didn't have the need, so a majority had four or less. So, not these massive, massive wall to wall plantations that we portray in the movies. And there's another fact here at the bottom that a lot of students have a hard time with, but freed slaves often went out and bought slaves. And again, it's not a question of morality, it is a question of how do I get the labor that I need to successfully harvest my crops. In the South, you're not going to have a whole lot of people that are willing to work for a wage that they're only going to get once a year. Remember, farmers only get money once a year, so that's when they would pay their people. So it really is there is nobody else to do the work except for slaves. And so if you're made a freedman and you want to be able to feed yourself, loan enough a family, if you somehow get freedom for them, you're going to have to own slaves in order to work your farm and make it successful. So it was just a reality of the times. It was not morality, it's reality. Oh, that was pretty good, wasn't it? Now, how do you control those large numbers of slaves? Because even if you're a good master, you know, I use that term loosely, but if you're a good master, you don't beat or maim them, they still want to run away. Of course they do. Nobody wants to be owned. So here you have the overseer. Remember, the overseer is going to be white. He's the guy that dishes out the jobs and the punishment and decides who's going to live in what slave hut and all that kind of stuff. But you also, on the larger plantations, had a driver who was a male slave, and it was his neck on the line. So if things went badly, he would get in trouble. And so the driver, a slave himself, might actually be the most violent of all the guys in charge on the entire plantation, because he has a lot more to lose than an overseer or a master if things go badly. So they do control, and again, as the overseer and the driver doing these things, they do control these large numbers with fear tactics and punishment. The first thing that they're going to do in order to keep their slave numbers is to brand them. So you see examples of brands here, and they were all very individual. They would put a list of all the brands for all the farms and plantations up in the local stores. And so if you found a slave who was not where they were supposed to be, you could look at the brand, which was usually either in the palm of their hand. Much later, we'll do it. They'll do it on the upper part of their back, so you can just pull their collar back and see it. And that way, you can't run away. People can see your insignia and know what farm you came from. If they wanted to punish you without hurting you so that you couldn't do work anymore, they might smoke you in the smokehouse when they smoke their meat. That's like a choking, horrible, uncomfortable, can't breathe kind of situation, super hot. Sometimes they would put you near a fire and throw pig fat in the fire, and so the fire and the fat would ignite and get all over you. They might drag you if you were being bad. Uh, Often male slaves were punished this way. You tie them to a horse and you drag them through the plantation, often naked. Not enough to hurt them forever or to keep them from working, but just enough to get your point across. So they also developed what we now call as slave codes. So slaves could no longer own property, firearms, they couldn't go to court, they were not allowed to learn. If you were caught disobeying any of these, including if you were white and you were teaching a slave how to read, you could actually be imprisoned for it. So, again, after that 1808, and the numbers are getting larger and larger, the whites in the South are going to really come down on the slaves that they do own. Now let's talk about the freed slaves. Slavery is going to be outlawed in the North in 1850, and I will get to why in a minute. But by 1850, the South also had some freed slaves. You see the number here, 225,000. And here's your reasons behind that, the top four at least. Perhaps they did serve heroically in a war and their master felt that they deserved to be free, or the federal government may even grant them their freedom. Masters did not always treat their slaves mean. Sometimes they loved them, and when they got to a certain age, it might be, hey, 18, you're a man, or you're 65, an older man, and you can't labor anymore. But for whatever reason, a master might just free them. Children of masters were often freed, and it depended on often whether the baby was born black or white. So you have a master who has had a child with his female slave, and the baby could be born white. This picture you see here off and to the side is brother and sister, Isaac and Rosa, and she's white and he's black, but they're pure brother and sister. So does Rosa get to be free because she's white automatically? No. Rosa was also a slave, and she grew up on the farm as a slave, daughter to her master, but still a slave because she was born of a slave mother. So every situation could be totally different. And in some cases, slaves were allowed to purchase their own freedom if their master allowed them to make money throughout their daily lives. So every situation on every plantation is different. We can't say that it is like they portray in the movies that every single one was evil, but you definitely would not say none of them were. So again, just depends on the plantation and the mentality of the people working it and running it. So, of course, there's going to be slave resistance. The number one way for slaves to resist was passively aggressively, I guess you could say. Those working in the field might act like they're too sick to work, might purposely just work slower, might purposely break their tools, but not do it in a way where you can tell that it was on purpose. So, there was always some type of resistance going on. But there are also cases of out and out rebellions. And Gabriel Prosser, we talked about this one already, but Gabriel Prosser decided that God wanted him to kill all the whites in the South and make himself king of the South. And of course, he plans it on a certain day, and a rainstorm comes, and people believe that maybe it was not God who told him to do this, but the devil, and now God is raining on it. And so people gave up Gabriel Prosser, and he was hung. Denmark Vesey was a lottery winner. His master, kind of as a joke, allowed him to play the lottery, and he won, and he bought his freedom. So he went north, felt guilty about those he left behind, came back, tried to free them illegally, help them escape, and of course he will be captured and he will be executed. The thing about Denmark that scared people is that here is a guy who was free, and he came back to get more people to freedom, doing it illegally. He was chancing his own freedom. That's how much these slaves wanted out of their position, and it scared people even more. So with Gabriel Prosser, things got tougher on slaves in the South. Denmark Vesey again got even tougher, but Nat Turner is the thing that really put the icing on the cake. Nat Turner was a very well loved preacher, and he was a black man, he was a slave, but apparently this guy was an amazing preacher, so much so that his master built him a church, and he allowed Nat to be in control of the church and to hold services for slaves. But his services were so good, and word got out about how good they were, that whites also attended Nat Turner's sermons. And so he was a very well loved, very popular, well known figure in the South. But he also had a dream that God spoke to him, and God told him to rise up against his master and to encourage others to do so as well and kill all the whites in the South. And so Nat Turner makes this plan. He incorporates other plantations and slaves and other plantations all around him, and they set a date, and on that night they all took hatchets and they went into the homes of their masters and killed everybody while they slept. And it's not just men, they killed men, women, and children. The total is a little murky. Sometimes you'll see it as he killed 50 people, other times it's 55, but either way he killed 50 or more. And so, of course, he is captured. He's not going to kill every white in the South, but his slave rebellion is considered successful because he did at least start to carry it off. And this one, more than any other event, including Toussaint Louverture, completely terrified the South that a slave could do this, and not just any slave, a beloved, trusted slave could do this. And so they skinned poor Nat Turner alive and allowed the community to come and watch and shout things and spit on him. And after he was skinned, still alive, he was hung. But that wasn't enough. Once Nat was hung, they also took the same hatchet that he had used to kill his masters and chopped him up into very small parts and gave the parts out to all the masters that had gathered to watch this event, and said, take this back to your slaves and tell them this is their mighty Nat Turner, and if they can take him down, they can definitely take the rest of the slaves down. And so it was a warning to the rest of the slaves to behave themselves. So poor Nat Turner was he was that kind of that last thing that the master said, no, we're going to completely shut down any kind of outside influence on our slaves, and things are going to get even worse. So the Underground Railroad became prominent because things were getting worse, and it didn't convince slaves to be nice and stay where they were. It encouraged them to want to leave even more. And so we get Harriet Tubman, who took 19 trips out of the South with about 300 slaves. She was a tough lady. She was a great leader. Came back 19 times to help other people find their freedom. There were all kinds of crazy ways that people found their freedom. They did it funeral processions where a runaway slave would be hidden inside a coffin and they would walk. They would use horses and they would all walk the coffin like they were all going to a funeral, and nobody's going to stop them, and they would go all the way to the north and find freedom. All kinds of crazy stuff. But Harriet Tubman is the most famous of all the Underground Railroad runners. So, as a result of everything you see on this page, the passive rebellions, the out and out rebellions, the Underground Railroad, harsher laws will be created to govern the lives of the slaves, and paranoia of the whites is just going to get worse and worse and worse. So, of course, the South is going to get a lot of heat from the North when slaves are running away, coming to the North, telling their stories. And you've got the abolitionist in the North, saying give them freedom too. So, Southerners decided that they needed to have some pro slavery propaganda. And so you would see things like this. Now, look, the Negro in his own country, savage. You see the skull laying on the ground. Actually, it looks like it might be a whole human. And, it's just savage and horrible. And you get the idea that maybe he doesn't have enough to eat or drink. And then look at here over on the right hand side, you've got them happy and healthy, and daddy's playing the banjo, and mama's and the kids are singing. And so that's how they're portraying the differences. We took them out of Africa and we saved them kind of mentality. All right, so we know what slavery was like. We know some of the people that were fighting against it. So let's find out exactly what it was that tore America apart. Because we've talked about this 1,000 times. It was not the issue of slavery, the moral issue of slavery. It was a lot of other things. Slavery just happens to be caught up in the mix. So let's go back in time and talk about the Missouri Compromise. You should already know this. Quick review. 1819, 11 free and 11 slave states, and everybody's happy. But Missouri decides she wants to be a slave state. And so Congress freaked out. We don't want to throw the balance off. Henry Clay, the great compromiser, says, no problem. We'll take Massachusetts. We'll divide it into two different states. Maine is born, and we will make Maine free. So now we'll have 12 and 12. Great idea. And if he had stopped there, it might not have been a big deal, but he didn't. He also drew that 3630 line across the Louisiana Territory, only the Louisiana Territory, and said no slavery above the line, which was a complete idiot move because Missouri was above the line and they had just made it a slave state. So the Missouri Compromise was really an idiot compromise, and no good came of it. And it still didn't decide what to do about the land out west. So just a silly compromise. Go also remember the nullification crisis. This is where the states for the first time threatened to secede the union. The North wants those high tariffs on imports, so their goods will be cheaper to buy. The South is being way overtaxed on shipping their goods out and getting goods in. And so South Carolina, under the tutelage of John Calhoun, says we're going to secede from the union, and we're going to nullify this tax or pretend it doesn't exist or say no to it. And of course, President Jackson gets the force bill to be passed by Congress, saying that he can use gunboat diplomacy and threaten to blow up South Carolina if they do not obey. So we know that South Carolina backed down, but we never really talked about any compromises that were made. Did the South just back down and walk away? Of course not. Henry Clay, the great compromiser, is to the rescue again. And he tells the South, we will lower the tax, which makes them super happy. But he tells the North, well, we're going to do it slowly over a 3-year period. And so the North feels like they also won. And so both sides claim victory. The South is going to get it to go away, but the North is going to really get to keep it for 3 years. So Henry Clay, again, really putting a Band-Aid on something that is going to come back and raise its ugly head again and again. We also already talked about the Mexican Cession. President Polk, remember him? He gained more territory than any other president in the United States history. He only served one term. He did this. He got this land so fast and with such a flurry of work that it literally killed him. He did not run for a second term because he was exhausted, and he dies 3 months after he leaves the presidency. So that should tell you how fast we gained this land. And Congress was terrified of what was going to happen in these lands. And when the question came, should they be free or should they be slave? And so they came up with this idea of using popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty basically means majority rule. So when a territory was about to be made a state, they had to have a vote whether it was going to be slave or free, and the winners won. Okay, so it sounds like a great idea, but bad things happen when people gather to vote over a hot topic, and we're going to learn more about that in a minute. But popular sovereignty was a huge congressional mistake. They will never admit that it was, but you'll find out it was a huge mistake. So let's look at the downfall. Where do we actually start to realize, oh my gosh, this is out of control? That starts with the Compromise of 1850. California wants to be a state. You should know why. It's 1850. What happened there in 1848? Of course, it was the gold rush. And by 49, California was a lawless place. There was murder and death everywhere, and they want to be a state so they can have militias there and sheriffs and some kind of organization. And we want California because California has the gold. So when California says, all right, we want into the Union and we want to be a free state, the South freaked out because it was a huge, huge state. And Southern senators even talked about seceding from the Union then. But here comes Henry Clay again. John Calhoun and Daniel Webster were there too, but Henry Clay is the leading guy. He's the compromiser, and he comes up with the Compromise of 1850. And this compromise allows California to be a state, but here is the rules that go along with it, or here are the rules. The North will not use their power in the Senate to get rid of slavery. They actually had to sign a document that they would not. Slavery in D.C. was completely outlawed because they didn't want to seem like they were on one side or another. So they just said in D.C. we won't deal with it. And that was kind of a bold move because some of the biggest trading places for slavery was in DC. One of the biggest ones I've ever been to on a historical tour was right outside the White House. You could see the White House from it. It's Lafayette Square. So that was a bold move. The rest of the area we gained from Mexico was all going to use popular sovereignty. And then here's the part that starts to tear us apart. They added to it, and this is to make the Southerners happy, they added to the Compromise of 1850 the Fugitive Slave Act. So they are actually together here. The Fugitive Slave Act is part of the Compromise of 1850, and it was added on to appease the Southerners, but the Northerners will freak out about the Fugitive Slave Act, and this is when they outlaw slavery in the North. So let's talk about what exactly was this Fugitive Slave Act. How does it upset everybody so much? So, of course, again, it was done in 1850 as part of the Compromise of 1850 to get California in as a state. It's often called the Bloodhound Bill. Make sure you know it by that. So, here's some of the rules of it. Any white person or black person could simply point at a black individual, scream runaway, and they will instantly be locked up. And it does not matter who that black person is. It could be a person that has papers. It could be a person that has lived in your community, north or south, for 20 years, and everybody knows they're free. They might even be a business owner. But for whatever reason, somebody has a vendetta against them. They point at them, they yell slave, and they are instantly locked up. So instantly they become a fugitive. And notice that I have it here in quotes. They are a fugitive. Fugitives have no right to trial, north or south. They have no right to trial. So they couldn't testify or go in and say, here's my free papers. In the end, it would be a federal commissioner who would decide whether or not this person really was a fugitive or whether this person was a freed black, or whether they were freed by their master or born free, whatever. But this federal commissioner is the one who got to decide this. And lo and behold, if you found in favor of the master, or the person who pointed out this black individual and yelled slave, then you got $5 extra. So these federal commissioners weren't even listening to the cases. They were just saying, we side with the master or the pointer outer, and we make $5 extra. So it was a setup. But the whites in the North were not upset over those parts of it. Like, they weren't up north going, this is completely unfair to black individuals. What they did care about is this next codicil. Anyone could be ordered to catch a runaway, or they would be jailed themselves as an accomplice to this person trying to run away. So the North, and make sure you add this to your notes even though it's not on here, the North said, if anyone can force us to help catch a runaway, then we are being enslaved by the Southerners. These Southerners coming north saying, you have to go help me catch a runaway, is enslaving whites in the North, because you're forcing them to do something they don't want to do. And so Northerners start to join the abolitionist cause in giant numbers, not because they care about slavery. It's because they're ticked off about this Fugitive Slave Act and the fact that they can now be forced to do something to help the South. And so that is just not going to sit right with anybody. Now, there are some people who start to question, what is slavery really like? Some Northerners. What is it really like? This Fugitive Slave Act has everybody so upset. What is slavery really like for those slaves living in the South? And this lady here, Harriet Beecher Stowe, is going to find out firsthand. She is a Quaker, living in the North her whole life, kind of sheltered, goes into the South to see what the heck is happening, and is completely horrified by what she finds. And so she, in turn, because of this Fugitive Slave Act, piquing her curiosity, she writes Uncle Tom's Cabin as a direct response to the Fugitive Slave Act. So let's look at her story a little bit. Uncle Tom's Cabin is considered the first real story about slavery, real first-hand account. She saw it, she talked to people, but it's from a white person, which means it's going to be listened to more than if it came straight from the mouth of a black person. And it's also a person who is not vested in slavery. She was a Quaker living in the North. Her family did not need slavery. They were business owners, and so she's not vested in it at all. And so you have this person who is a complete outsider telling this horrific account. It was super popular in 1852. The day it was published, 3,000 people bought it. 3,000 in a day in 1852. That's phenomenal. By 1855, it was voted the most popular novel of the time. 300,000 sold in the first year. So the South calls her a liar. They say none of this is true. The North calls her a hero, and so it's going to further divide the Union. We love her, we hate her kind of mentality. But it also divides blacks. There is a character in it called Uncle Tom, and he's an older black male slave. And in the beginning of the book, he's basically the guy in charge of this plantation, but he is a yes man. Like, he never speaks out against the master or the overseer or the driver. He's this sweet guy that just wants everybody to get along. He doesn't want anybody to be hurt. And so a lot of blacks, after this book came out, used the term Uncle Tom. They would call male slaves an Uncle Tom as a nasty connotation, that you give in too easy, you suck up to the master, and so Uncle Tom became a bad thing. Just in defense of Uncle Tom, in the end of the book, he is killed trying to defend some of the slaves and keep the secret of where they went. And so he's a hero in the book. He saves people. But in the beginning, because he is a yes man, he gets a very bad reputation. And even today, listen close to some movies and things that you might hear in the theater. If somebody says Uncle Tom, calls a black man Uncle Tom, that's not nice. And now you know where it came from. So let's talk more about the nation as a whole. So by 1853, we're getting way too big, and we need a plan to join the nation. And the idea will be to do it through a transcontinental railroad. So the decision of the day is, where should it go? The first idea, of course, was that it was going to be a southern route through the Gadsden Purchase, ha 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 ha, or blah ha ha ha, you see it there. And of course, we know that's not going to work because the Gadsden Purchase was way too mountainous. And so there was a senator from Illinois named Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas thinks manifest destiny is true. He hates Indians. He's super, super prejudiced about anybody who's not white. And we'll come back to more about him later. But he says, let's set the railhead in Illinois. So if you see the map here, if you set it in Illinois and it's a northern route to go all the way to the west coast, there's a serious problem. It's going to have to run through Nebraska territory, which was completely unsettled. And you can't run a railroad through an unsettled area. So that immediately is going to start problems. But Stephen Douglas is hard headed and he's not going to give up on the idea of starting it in Illinois and running it through Nebraska territory, which means he's going to have to find a way to settle both Nebraska and Kansas while he's at it, just to make sure all that territory is ready for a transcontinental railroad. All right, so Stephen's got to get Stephen's got to get Nebraska organized. There are people that say no to it. They think it's a bad idea. So another deal is going to be struck in Congress. You know, those never go well, especially in this time period. And the deal is that the Missouri Compromise is going to be repealed. Remember that 3630 line? Because senators wanted to be able to allow slavery in Nebraska. So Nebraska is in the Louisiana Territory. So, or that purchase area. So that's the rule. Missouri Compromise is going to be dissolved. That's exactly what Stephen Douglas does. But he says, let's let Kansas and Nebraska, because they're right there together, we'll let Kansas and Nebraska decide through popular sovereignty. Horrible idea. Sounded good at the time. Congress is not going to have to make any major decisions about slavery. We'll just let people decide for themselves. The Missouri Compromise is now gone. It's a kind of a weight off of our shoulders now. So it all sounds good, but there are people that are going to oppose it. Like I said, this is going to destroy the Whig Party once and for all, and they will officially, because of Stephen Douglas and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, they will officially become Republicans forever. So remember, the Whig Party meant that the president thought he was the king, and it was kind of a derogatory thing against Jackson. And people were still using that idea. The Whig Party was against the king, but now they're saying there is no king and we want justice. And so they will get rid of the Whig Party and become Republicans forever. So that is one major legacy of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But the other major legacy is something called Bleeding Kansas. So let's take a look at the map. So here's the map. I just want you to see how big it is. These are territories that are going to be open to slavery, everything in yellow. Okay, so we've settled the green. They are all free states. We've settled the orange. They are all slave states. So you have this massive, massive section of America that is going to be open to popular sovereignty. Okay, so people are going to rush to the polls to vote for what they want their state to be. So how does that lead to Bleeding Kansas? So it's 1854. Kansas is right in the middle of both free and slave states. And here's the map again. So people, when they find out we're going to do this through popular sovereignty, run to the polls. Look, they are right there on that line. So you've got people all around them of opposing views. All around them, you've got free and slave states. And the people in Kansas are completely mixed. So these people run to vote. Only 20 of every 600 voters were actually residents. So you had thousands of people voting, but remember, only 20 out of every 600 actually lived there. But you've got free state people surrounding them that want this new territory to be free, and the same with slave states. They want this new territory to be slaves. So people are crossing into Kansas territory to illegally vote, and it ends up splitting Kansas in half. Kansas becomes two separate entities, both called Kansas. They each had their own government, they each had their own constitution, and they're still fighting one another. So they're creating this legislature in both Kansases, and they're still fighting one another. And all of this comes to a head in Lawrence, Kansas. Which Kansas? Lawrence, Kansas. 7 months of fighting. 200 people are killed, most of them with pitchforks, bloody, 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 and you've got $2 million in property damage. And that's why we call it Bleeding Kansas, because people died very violently and we had that much damage. So that literally the ground was tore up. And so we call this whole event loss of life, loss of land, Bleeding Kansas. And all of this is over that idea, really bad idea, of popular sovereignty. So hopefully you care enough to be sitting there right now asking yourself, well, who wins? Kansas is gonna Kansasans. How do you say that? Kansas citizens have been killing each other. So what are they when they're entered as an actual, real, honest to goodness state? What are they? They're going to be a free state. So that really upsets the South because they feel like the balance is way out of control. If you remember the Nebraska territory, that's so northern that everybody's positive that it's going to be a free state when they're made a state. So all of Nebraska, all of Kansas, that giant section that you saw, they think it's all going to be free. And so the South is really upset. They've got to find land someplace else and make it slave. And so they turn to Cuba. They decide they want to take Cuba away from Spain. So Cuba was always a place that America wanted. President Polk actually went to Spain and offered $100 million at one time, and the Spanish said no. So here we go again. We want Cuba. President Pierce, who is very much on the southern side, secretly went to the Spanish and offered them $150 million. But he also created a document based on this offer. It was called the Austin Manifesto. Now, this is the president doing this, President Pierce. So, the Austin Manifesto said, we are going to offer you $150 million for Cuba, but if you do not accept the offer, we're going to consider this a threat to the safety of America and a reason to go to war with you. And so we will take it if we have to. So $150 million, or we will take it. That's the Austin Manifesto. And again, it's done by a president who is leaning towards the Southern view. And so somehow Northerners get wind of this and they feel like it's a ploy to extend slavery, to find outside sources to make the South more powerful than the North. And I mean, it just completely blows up. So it's seen as very brazen. The United States is torn apart. The North saying they've been lied to, or they're having secrets hidden from them by the president, and the South saying, yeah, but look, you're taking all this free, the land up north, and you're making it all free, and we're losing out. And so the Austin Manifesto blows up in everybody's face. Of course, we're not going to get Cuba. Spain laughs their way all the way back to Spain and says, hey, America's gone crazy. And so all this did, the Austin Manifesto, was drive an even deeper wedge between the North and the South. So speaking of wedges, we can't talk about this time period without talking about Dred Scott versus Sanford, a Supreme Court case. So in 1857, the question came to the court, if you take a slave to a free state, is he still a slave? So this happened to a man by the name of Dred Scott. Dred Scott belonged to a family in the South who loved him, and he was treated as a member of the family. He had been a slave of the same family since the day he was born, and it just so happened that when he was born was about the same time that his master and his wife were having children, and so Dred Scott grew up with the white children. They played together. They were friends, and so they really loved Dred. Well, it just so happened that the wife of the master passed away, and several years before the master himself. But when the master passed away, all his children were grown and gone, and so time passed and nobody knew what to do with the plantation, and here's all these slaves without any kind of guidance. And so the state decided that they were going to take apart the estate, and then they would just give the money to the kids when the kids did finally show up. And so everything was sold, including Dred. So when the family found out that Dred had been sold, they of course want him back. Well, the new master had already moved him, and he moved him to free soil. And so the family that had raised Dred Scott said to the lawyers on both sides, but he's on free soil, and we think that means that he should be free. And so it ends up making it all the way to the Supreme Court. And here's the guy, you see the guy over here to the far right. He's the Chief Justice, Roger Taney. And Tanny is the one who has to make the decision or the ruling decision in this case. And this is what he says: slaves are not citizens. So Dred should not even be allowed in the courtroom nor his case to be heard. Slaves are not citizens, but he takes it one more step. Nor are they human. They are simply property. So this is the first time that it's on the books in American legal books that blacks are not human. They are simply property. And then he says that slavery cannot legally be excluded from any U.S. territory. Well, that just tears everything apart, because if a state has come into the Union as a free state, and now you're saying that slavery can't be excluded from any U.S. territory, this is going to make everybody completely confused, but it sure is going to make the Republicans of the North outraged. So poor Dred Scott does not get his freedom. Blacks are seen as not human, and this question of slavery is bigger than ever before. In the background of all of this, we have two very powerful voices, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. So in 1858, it's the Illinois Senate race, and the two of these are the top contenders, these two guys. There are 7 total debates. So Abraham Lincoln is running on the Republican ticket, Stephen Douglas on the Democrat ticket. And Stephen gets a reputation as a big mouth. He is a small guy, especially when you stand him next to Abe, who's well over 6 foot. So he gets the nickname for his big mouth and his little body, the little giant, and the giant being his mouth. And so Douglas comes up with something called the Freeport Doctrine during these debates. And he says, through popular sovereignty, slavery will only exist where people want it. Nobody is forcing slavery on anybody. So the main platform of Stephen Douglas in 1858 is the Freeport Doctrine, which basically means popular sovereignty. And I told you this was a huge, huge mistake. Popular sovereignty never worked. So Douglas is saying the Freeport Doctrine over and over. Lincoln, this is when he comes up with that house divided against itself cannot stand. He's not saying he's pro slavery or anti slavery. He's simply saying we have to be all one or the other. We can no longer stand divided. So he's saying his platform is to find ways to bring the country back together. And one of the biggest examples that he can think of is over slavery. So he's saying we need to make a decision for or against as a country and unite. So Lincoln is going to lose the election, but he was such a calm figure during these tirades of Douglas, and I'll show you in a minute some of the terrible things that Douglas said. But Douglas would get up there and just throw these fits, and Lincoln would stand there very stoically, very well composed, and the things that he said made sense, and he never lost his temper, even with Stephen Douglas in his face, and so he got this reputation as a very good political leader, and he becomes a national figure. So those Illinois debates, the Senate debates, will definitely pummel or portray him as a leader and put him in the position of becoming president later. So let's look at some of the things they said about each other. This is one of my favorite historical lines. Lincoln said, "I would love to talk to Mr. Douglas man to man and face to face, but I would not know which of his faces to look at." I love that. So Lincoln is saying he's two-faced. Now Douglas kind of goes with whatever he thinks the crowd wants to hear, and he's not smart enough to realize that some of these people are at all of the debates. So regardless of the city in Illinois that you're talking to, you might be talking to the same people over and over. So debate number 4, I hold that a Negro is not and never ought to be a citizen of the United States. I hold that this government was made on a white basis, made by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever, and should be administered by white men and none others. But look at number 6. Let us discard all this quibbling about this race and that race, and the other race being inferior, and therefore they must be placed in an inferior position. Let us discard all these things and unite as one people throughout this land until we shall once more stand up declaring that all men are created equal. So he's starting to sound more like Lincoln. I think he was afraid that Lincoln's logic about a house divided was pretty logical, and maybe Stephen Douglas should be using that as well. Douglas didn't really care about slavery being voted up or voted down. He did not care about anything. And this is Lincoln here in red, and he said it. Douglas does not care whether slavery is voted up or voted down, but God cares, and humanity cares, and I care. And with God's help, I shall not fail. I may not see the end, but it will come, and I shall be vindicated. And these men will find that they have not read their Bibles right. All right, their Bibles right. So totally different mentalities, but you see Douglas kind of morphing into Lincoln's ideas towards the end. It was just enough to save him. And so Douglas will actually be made senator, but Lincoln becomes famous. And that is the final result of the Lincoln Douglas debates. Lincoln becomes famous. All right, so let's go back to what are people doing to get rid of slavery? We can't talk about that without talking about John Brown. John Brown in 1859, he was a white man. I know in this picture he looks almost Indian, but he's a white guy. See the blue eyes. And he decided that he was going to incite a slave revolt, and he was going to find a way to give slaves weapons so that they could successfully rise up against their masters, real weapons, not just hatchets. He wanted a replay of what happened in Haiti, basically. And so he decides that he needs to go steal the weapons at Harper's Ferry. Um, and he is going to invade the arsenal. He goes with 21 men, five are black, all the rest are white. He takes 11 hostages along the way, and he is holed up in the arsenal, which, by the way, ended up being pretty empty. Robert E. Lee is brought in to stop him, and after a pretty heated exchange, they do capture Brown. He gives up, and all of the men are going to be executed, Brown included. And his death really asks people to question what are we doing here? What are we doing here? A white man, for the first time, is going to be hung because he was trying to get rights for black individuals. So immediately, in many minds, this hanging is going to make John Brown a martyr. So he becomes a hero. And one of the reasons that he did become a martyr was not just the fact that he was a white guy fighting for the rights of blacks, it was the way that he acted when he came out of the courthouse. So when he came out of the courthouse, they're going to walk him to the place where they're going to hang him, and it's a good walk. If you ever get a chance to go to Charlestown, it's a good walk coming out of the courthouse to go to where he is hung. And so he has a lot of time to think about what is about to happen to him at the gallows. But he comes out of the courthouse and he is not upset. He is actually kissing and hugging anybody there, including black individuals. I love this picture. He's kissing a little black baby. And people saw him as this calm figure that was sure about what he did. He didn't have any regrets. And so he was ready to die in the name of freedom for slaves. So he becomes a martyr to many. Others saw John Brown as a traitor. So you see this here, South Carolina, Southerner, of course. This is part of a write up in a newspaper, and it says the Telegraph has informed us that bloody outbreak is, by confession of its northern ringleaders, a concerted movement of abolitionists and their black victims in southern states. While we can see no cause for present alarm or fail to regard it as a pregnant sign of the times, a prelude to what must and will recur again and again as the progress of sectional hate and black Republican success advances to their consummation. In other words, Brown is now a hero. Holy crap, what are we going to do to fix this? So a lot of people said, hey, the North is coming to take over the South, and people are like freaking out, becoming super worried about what the other side is going to do, to extremes. And so John Brown, his legacy and his death makes him a martyr, but it also makes the deepest division yet between the North and the South. So by the time that we get to the election of 1860, our country has no idea what the heck is about to happen. We hate one another. There's just no happiness. Nobody's really sure who to vote for, except that they don't want to vote for Douglas. Look at this. Look at this here. This is all that Douglas got. That little blue area. That's it. So the election of 1860 really does come down to Lincoln and Breckinridge. So you can see the difference here. And of course, Lincoln is going to win with 40% of the vote, but there's no real gung ho, this guy's the clear winner. And that is just a sign of the times. Look at the top. the top, the north and the west is all Lincoln, and then the south is all Breckinridge. So you've got Republicans in the north, Democrats in the south, and that's the way that they're voting. So you can see the line, other than a few Bell and Douglas in the middle, you can see the line of people for and against slavery and for and against each other, definitely a line preparing for the Civil War that's about to come. And so South Carolina, during the entire presidential campaign, had threatened to secede if Lincoln was elected. And of course, Lincoln does get elected in 1860, and they are true to their word. South Carolina secedes by December of that same year, and 2 months later, you've got all the states here that you see also falling into the line of seceding the Union. And so you see the Civil War on a map right here in front of you. And that is where we will pick up the next time that I talk with you. So, hope that this was a great adventure for you, and I will talk at you soon.